$12 million. That's all it took to shatter the illusion, to expose what no headline dared to print. In front of 11 million viewers on live national television, J.D. Vance didn't just confront Elizabeth Warren, he unraveled her. One leaked file, one cold question, one moment that sent shockwaves through every political office in D.C. She came prepared with talking points. He came with proof. And when it was over, the question wasn't if she had something to hide. It was, how long had she been hiding it? But before we continue, a brief word. While this story is a dramatized reconstruction inspired by real public figures, the dialogue, events, and revelations you're about to witness are fictionalized. And yet, what makes it powerful is that the emotion is real. The questions we raise reflect real concerns, real frustrations, and the longing for truth that millions of Americans feel every day. Now, back to the moment where silence ended and the spotlight turned hot. Stay with us. This isn't just a story. It's a moment America won't forget. The phone rang at 11:42 p.m. J.D. Vance had just finished reviewing a draft speech on supply chain reform when the screen of his phone lit up. Unknown number, New York. Most late-night calls meant one of two things. Either something had broken or someone was about to. He stared at the screen for a second longer than usual, then picked up. Senator Vance? The voice on the other end was crisp, practiced, television polished. This is Rebecca Carter, senior producer at State Line Sunday. We'd like to extend a formal invitation for this weekend's panel. J.D. leaned back slowly in his leather chair. The Capitol office was mostly dark, except for the glow of one desk lamp and the blinking modem in the corner. His eyes narrowed. I see. What's the topic? Tech regulation, AI oversight, free speech accountability in digital markets. She rattled it off like it was lifted from a bullet point press brief. You'd be joining Senator Elizabeth Warren. We're aiming for a balanced, vigorous discussion. There it was. The real story wasn't the topic. It was the guest list. J.D. sat up straighter, spine alert now. Warren wasn't just another Democrat. She was an institution, a professor turned crusader, someone who'd mastered the game so well she could disguise power grabs as moral imperatives. She didn't show up for debates unless the optics were guaranteed. And State Line Sunday? That wasn't just any show. It was watched by senators, donors, swing voters, and the people who wrote the next week's headlines. J.D.'s fingers tapped against his glass of water, slowly, quietly. Why now? He asked. A pause. Well, the producer said carefully, you've been gaining traction in key states. People are listening to your message on foreign interference. We thought it might be time the audience hears both sides. J.D. smirked. Both sides. As if he hadn't been locked out of primetime panels for over a year. As if his push to investigate foreign investment in American farmland hadn't been called fringe until the headlines proved otherwise. He knew a trap when he saw one. The timing was too clean, the framing too neutral. A high-profile progressive versus a so-called populist, live in front of 11 million households. They weren't offering him a stage. They were offering him a setup. And yet, J.D. didn't flinch. He stood, walked slowly toward the tall window of his office. Outside, the dome of the Capitol shimmered in quiet defiance. He thought of the towns he'd visited in the past 6 months. Steel plants shuttered, high schools turned into warehouses, communities told they were transitioning without being told to what. He wasn't the one on trial. He returned to the desk, picked up the pen beside him, clicked it once, then again. All right, he said finally, let's give them something they didn't script. There was a pause on the line, a flicker of hesitation. Then, we'll see you Sunday, Senator. As he hung up, J.D.'s aide poked her head into the office. You're still here? She asked him, surprised. J.D. nodded, staring at the phone as if it had just delivered a message from a different dimension. Looks like I've got a date with Elizabeth Warren, he said flatly. She raised an eyebrow. On State Line? That's a war zone in a tuxedo. J.D. cracked a grin. Exactly, and I don't wear tuxedos. But even as he joked, a flicker of tension crossed his face. Subtle, but real. Because if they were calling him now, it meant something was coming. Something bigger than a panel or a poll. Something that needed silencing. And somewhere deep down, J.D. Vance was no longer asking what the trap was. He was already planning how to flip it. By the time J.D. left the Capitol the next morning, D.C. had that sharp gray air only February could bring. Part fog, part tension. The kind of weather where the city itself felt like it was holding its breath. He didn't go to his Senate office. He didn't call his staff. Instead, he drove himself unannounced to a nondescript diner off Constitution Avenue. No aides, no press. Just him, a black coffee, and a corner booth facing the street. At 8:04 a.m., a man slid into the seat across from him. "Still ordering coffee like it's 2006, the man muttered. "What? No oat milk, Senator?" J.D. didn't smile. "Still showing up late, Collins?" Lucas Collins, former Navy Signal Intelligence, the man who once jammed a Russian broadcast drone from 10,000 feet above the Mediterranean, now a quiet cybersecurity consultant who barely existed online and only called when things were delicate. Lucas pulled out a plain manila folder. No markings, no seals. Just one yellow post-it stuck to the front. J.D.'s eyes dropped to it. She sold the policy before she wrote it. Lucas placed it on the table gently, like it might still be radioactive. "That came from a back-end mirror we pulled off a cloud drive," he said, "encrypted with rotating keys, buried under 2 layers of front organizations. Took us weeks to verify." J.D. opened the folder. Inside, cross-referenced transaction records, donor maps, speech drafts edited by lobbyists before being finalized, and a list of foreign nationals sitting quietly on advisory boards of American nonprofits. Many of them connected, directly or indirectly, to a climate initiative Warren had backed 3 months earlier. Lucas kept his voice low. "The same shell company backing this group bought up 4,000 acres of Midwestern farmland last year. Cheap, strategic, near rail and water access." J.D. didn't look up. Lucas leaned in. "It's not just about money, it's access, influence. The bills weren't written to regulate. They were written to guide investment, American legislation, as a global investment product." J.D. closed the folder slowly. His knuckles were white against the coffee cup now. No camera was rolling. No microphone was on. But what he felt wasn't rage. It was that colder, heavier sensation. The one you feel when you realize the game is being played on a board you weren't supposed to see. Lucas tapped the folder. That post-it line came from an email buried in the metadata. Her own staffer wrote it. They were joking, but not really. J.D. stared out the window. People were walking by in scarves and briefcases, utterly unaware that 3 blocks from the Capitol sat a file that could derail a senator's career, or possibly more. "What do you want me to do with this?" he asked quietly. Lucas didn't blink. "I didn't come to ask you anything. I just remembered the guy who used to say, 'If the system smells like smoke, someone's setting fires for profit.'" There was a long silence. J.D. finally reached for the folder again, this time more firmly. He tucked it under his arm, nodded once, and stood. "I won't tell my team yet," he said. "Not until I know how deep it goes." Lucas just sipped his coffee and looked out the window. "You've got 3 days until that debate." J.D. paused in the doorway. "And Warren?" Lucas cracked his knuckles. "She's already smiling for the camera." J.D. stepped outside into the sharp cold, folder pressed tight to his ribs. A gust of wind hit his coat, but he didn't flinch. He didn't head back to his office. He didn't answer texts. He just walked, past monuments, past tourists, past marble halls. And the only thought running through his mind now wasn't if he should use it. It was when. The studio smelled like powder and nerves. When J.D. stepped through the side entrance of the CNN headquarters, he wasn't met with producers or assistants. He was greeted by silence, that quiet hum of a machine, too polished to reveal its moving parts. The kind of place where news wasn't just reported, it was choreographed. He was led down a narrow hallway, past blinking teleprompters and huddled tech crews, to a green room that wasn't green at all. The walls were soft gray. The lighting was flattering. The couches were far too white for coffee to be allowed. A young staffer with a clipboard approached him. "Senator Vance, welcome. You'll be in segment 3. Panel opens in 15. Can I get you anything? JD shook his head. Just water. Room temp. The staffer nodded and disappeared. He set his briefcase down on the table and sat. His coat stayed on. He didn't unpack. Instead, he scanned the room. 2 makeup chairs, a monitor showing the live countdown, and a bowl of almonds nobody touched. Inside his coat pocket, pressed flat against his chest, was the folder. He hadn't read it again since the diner. He didn't need to. The facts hadn't changed. The stakes had. As the digital clock above the door ticked closer to airtime, the door behind him swung open with a quiet whoosh. Elizabeth Warren entered like she'd done this 100 times, which, of course, she had. Her posture was perfect. Her makeup was already done. Her expression walked the line between warm and calculating with the precision of a practiced violinist. She waved to the lighting crew, exchanged greetings with a producer, then turned to the aide trailing behind her, clipboard in hand. The aide leaned in and whispered just loud enough for JD to hear. Just paint him as another populist punching air. We've done this before. JD didn't turn, didn't blink, but something in his jaw set slightly. His thumb tapped the armrest once, twice. Then slowly he stood and looked up, not at Warren, not at the aide, but at the lights hanging overhead. Hundreds of them, beaming down with synthetic perfection, each one focused, filtered, prepped to hide every wrinkle and reveal every crack. He murmured to no one in particular, "Then let's knock the ceiling down." The producer called out, 5 minutes, from just beyond the doorway. Warren glanced over and gave JD a tight-lipped nod. Political courtesy, performative civility. She didn't recognize the shift in his tone or the stillness behind his eyes. JD returned the nod, but inside he wasn't planning a debate. He was planning a detonation. His phone buzzed once. Lucas, we traced 3 more land deals, all tied to the same shell group. JD didn't reply, just locked the screen and slid it back into his pocket. A makeup artist came to dab his forehead. Another fluffed his collar. The anchor's voice echoed faintly from the studio floor. And next, an exclusive face-off between 2 of America's most talked-about senators. JD exhaled slowly. He wasn't here to play defense. He was here to pull the thread. And the moment the cameras turned on, the only question left was, would the system unravel, or would it finally show its teeth? The lights snapped on like a command. JD Vance took his seat at the long glass-paneled desk, just as the theme music faded, and the host's voice shifted from casual warmth to stage-ready polish. Good evening, America. Tonight on State Line Sunday, 2 of the most talked-about figures in the Senate join us to debate the future of American technology, free speech, and foreign influence. With us, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Senator JD Vance of Ohio. The camera panned slowly. JD sat still, unblinking, his hands folded calmly on the desk in front of him. To the audience, it looked like confidence. To those who knew him well, it was tension held in place by strategy. Warren, on the other hand, came alive like she'd just stepped into her classroom back at Harvard Law. Thank you, Tom, she began, with a smile that was warm, but not soft. Let me be clear. The American people are under siege, not from some foreign army, but from unchecked corporate greed and a digital system rigged against working families. JD didn't look at her. He looked straight ahead, as if already watching the fallout before it began. Warren continued, For too long, big tech has profited off our data, silenced our voices, and manipulated markets with zero accountability. And while some in this room have chosen to distract or divide, she paused just enough to signal her target without naming it. I've chosen to legislate. The host nodded, impressed. The studio audience, carefully selected, socially diverse, media-trained, offered polite applause. Last month, she went on, I introduced a bill that would prevent foreign-backed tech conglomerates from quietly buying their way into American infrastructure. Because our future shouldn't be for sale to the highest bidder. JD's left hand tightened slightly, not enough for the cameras to catch, but enough, because he'd read that bill. He knew what it left out. He knew what it hid beneath polished language and patriotic phrasing. He knew who had helped write it, and who stood to profit from it. Warren wasn't lying. Not technically. She was doing something more dangerous. She was telling the truth. Selectively. My bill puts workers first, she declared, voice rising with well-practiced force. It demands transparency from companies with foreign ties, and it ensures that no billionaire, no lobbyist, no foreign investor can ever manipulate our democracy again. Applause again. A few heads nodded earnestly in the audience. The host offered a neutral smile. And let's be honest, Warren added, glancing briefly toward JD now. Some folks are real good at yelling on social media, but when it comes time to show up with solutions, they fall short. There it was, a well-placed jab. JD didn't react, not with words, not with expression, because he wasn't here to respond. He was here to reveal. The host turned, smoothly pivoting. Senator Vance, your thoughts? For a moment, JD said nothing. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Just enough to make the audio tech in the back room glance at the signal feed. Just enough to make the host's eyes flicker with uncertainty. Then JD leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. I appreciate Senator Warren's passion. I just wonder if the people funding her passion feel the same way about ours. A slight shift in the room. Warren's jaw stiffened, but she kept her smile. JD continued, voice calm, every word clipped just enough to cut. Because when a policy is funded before it's written, when foreign-linked donors draft the outline while Main Street watches their factories disappear, maybe the real threat to democracy isn't the one yelling online. The camera slowly zoomed in. And maybe, JD added, it's the one whispering in the back room while pretending to lead from the front. The applause didn't come this time. The host blinked, the energy shifted, and just like that, the debate became something else entirely. The silence that followed JD's final sentence wasn't dead air. It was something sharper. The host, sensing the shift, tried to smooth it over. Senator Vance, are you suggesting there's something misleading in Senator Warren's bill? JD offered a polite nod, the kind that didn't rise to the bait but refused to back down. Not at all. I'm sure the bill has noble intentions, he said, tone even, measured. I'm just curious, how much does it cost to write one these days? A flicker passed across Warren's face. She didn't speak, yet, but the smile she wore moments ago had gone tight at the corners. JD reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. No need to guess, he continued, producing a single folded page. Let's take a look. He laid it flat on the desk in front of him, a printed chart, color-coded, clear, damning in its simplicity. The blue column shows contributions to Senator Warren's political past over the past 12 months, he explained, tapping the page once. The green column? Donations made directly to 3 climate nonprofits that co-wrote language included in her recent tech regulation bill. The chart was neatly organized, but the names listed beneath the green column made the host blink twice. D2A Solutions, Atlantic Sphere Ventures, Unified Horizons, the kind of names that sounded like think tanks but moved like hedge funds. JD didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The overlap is more than symbolic, he said. In fact, between the 3 groups, we see nearly $2.7 million donated to organizations tied to renewable infrastructure investments, after those same organizations had closed private land deals across 5 Midwest states, all within 60 days of the bill's introduction. Warren tilted her head slightly and gave a soft, incredulous laugh. Let me guess, she said, voice dipped in mock patience. This is the part where I'm secretly working for Beijing, right? Or maybe Big Win. A few chuckles scattered through the audience, but not as many as she expected. JD didn't flinch. No, Senator, he replied. This is the part where we stop pretending the American voter is too distracted to read a financial report. The host looked from one face to the other, unsure if it was time to intervene or lean back and let the temperature rise. Warren rolled her eyes. Senator Vance, if you think advocating for clean energy and fighting climate change is a scandal, then you're welcome to that opinion. But the facts are clear. This bill was written to protect American families from foreign influence in our digital markets. Period. JD tapped the chart again. Then perhaps you could explain why those same protective policies just happen to benefit a Chinese-backed investment group that now owns 6,000 acres of farmland in southern Ohio? That one landed. There was no laughter this time. Even the host leaned forward slightly, eyebrows lifting just enough to betray surprise. Warren opened her mouth but hesitated. JD didn't press further. He just folded the paper in half, placed it neatly on the desk, and said quietly, "We can disagree on policy, Senator. But let's not pretend we don't know how this game is played." Warren recovered quickly. "We're talking about a handful of donors." JD cut in, calm but deliberate. "They're not donating. They're investing. There's a difference. And I think America deserves to know which side of that table their representatives are sitting on." The clock ticked past the 12-minute mark. Viewers at home leaned closer. The studio had gone quieter than it should have for a Sunday night. The host cleared his throat. "We'll be right back after this." And for the first time since the broadcast began, J.D. Vance didn't just look like a guest. He looked like the one holding the pen. The commercial break was only 90 seconds long, but something had changed in the room. Elizabeth Warren straightened her blazer, whispered to her aide, and took a sip of water with a touch more force than necessary. J.D. Vance, meanwhile, sat quiet, unreadable. He wasn't adjusting. He wasn't blinking. He was waiting. The moment the camera light flipped red again, the host leaned forward with a smile that was just a little too wide. "Welcome back. Before the break, we heard Senators Warren and Vance discuss campaign finance and foreign influence in tech legislation. Senator Warren, care to respond?" Warren returned the smile, but there was a flicker behind it now, something taut. "Let's be honest here," she began, hands folded, voice carefully modulated. "This is a classic playbook. Take a good bill, throw some shadow at it, and hope people are too confused to know who to trust. But I've built my career on transparency, and I'm not about to let conspiracy theories define the conversation." She turned toward JD, eyes narrowed just enough to sharpen her tone. "I'm proud of the Digital Sovereignty Act, and I won't apologize for trying to protect American consumers." JD nodded once, slowly, as if absorbing every word. Then he leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I don't think the bill is the problem," he said evenly. "I think the problem is who helped write it." Warren's smile returned, thinner now. "You mean my staff? My legislative team?" JD shook his head. "I mean Pax Terra Foundation." The name hung in the air for a second, unfamiliar to most but not to everyone. On the other side of the studio glass, one of the CNN producers frowned and began typing rapidly on a tablet. Warren blinked once. JD continued. "A so-called environmental nonprofit based out of Colorado, registered under 501c4 status, publicly promotes climate equity. Privately, very privately, it also manages shell investment accounts linked to Horizon Holdings, a firm headquartered in Shenzhen. That same firm recently finalized purchases of strategic farmland across Indiana, Iowa, and southern Ohio. Less than 3 months after your bill passed through committee with favorable tax treatment for agriculture-adjacent solar pilots." The studio temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Warren scoffed, visibly annoyed now. "Oh, come on, are we seriously going to suggest that a nonprofit supporting renewable energy is part of some international land grab?" She waved a hand dismissively, as if brushing away fog. "Do you even have proof?" JD didn't blink. He just looked at her and smiled, not smugly, but slowly, like someone who already knew how the story ended. "No, Senator," he said. "I have something better." He reached inside his jacket pocket, not for a file, not for a paper, but for a small wireless device, discreet, palm-sized, with a simple black button. "I have your voice." Warren froze. Even the host leaned back an inch. JD placed the device on the table gently. "I have the internal call from March. You weren't on camera, but your voice is clear. Your policy director refers to Pax Terra as the green sugar daddy that keeps giving. You respond, so long as they keep the language vague and the checks clear, we'll keep the flag in front." The silence was immediate and total. For a split second, Warren's mask slipped. Just a flash, but enough. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, then clamped shut again. She turned to the host. "This is outrageous. If that clip even exists," JD cut in, voice still calm. "It does. And behind the studio glass, a second producer mouthed to a third, "Do we have legal clearance for this?" The host glanced sideways, visibly rattled, then cleared his throat. "Well, I think we'll need to take another quick break." But the damage had already been done, not by a headline, not by a file, by a single sentence, and the knowledge that somewhere off camera, truth had just been recorded. The second commercial break bled into silence behind the scenes. Producers whispered in corners. Legal staff checked their inboxes. The host rubbed his temple like someone trying to erase the last 10 minutes from his career. And Elizabeth Warren, poised as ever, stared straight ahead, jaw tight, eyes distant, like someone calculating 1,000 scenarios at once. JD didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He was reading a message on his phone, freshly delivered by a staffer who'd entered the green room without knocking, placed the phone quietly on the table beside him, and slipped back out. The message had one word: delivered. Below it was a download link, secure, encrypted, verified by 3 digital watermarks. Sender, Sentinel. The name meant little to most people, but JD remembered it. A ghost from his campaign's earliest days. A former digital ops contractor who'd walked away from the party circuit when they realized their job wasn't building firewalls. It was building walls between voters and truth. He tapped the file. It opened instantly, no password. A Zoom recording, no fancy overlay, no music. Just a private fundraising session with a low-res video panel of 6 familiar faces, Warren's senior aide, 2 Silicon Valley strategists, and 3 PAC representatives JD had seen on FEC filings a dozen times over. JD listened. At first it was background chatter, policy fluff, donation deadlines, mutual praise. But then came the line. "Look, we'll fund the push, but keep the language vague. If it's too specific, we can't pivot if the investment stream changes." Followed by a nod from Warren's aide. "Not a problem. We're already drafting the clauses to stay intentionally broad. Just enough patriotism, no concrete oversight. We'll tie it to digital sovereignty and spin it green." JD froze, not in shock, but in confirmation. It wasn't just influence anymore. It was intent. He rewound it, played it again. Same voices, same timing, same quiet confidence in the belief that the American public would never hear this. Then at the bottom of the screen, timestamp, March 12th, 2 weeks before the bill was introduced. 3 days before Pax Terra made its largest foreign-backed donation on record. JD placed the phone face down. A slow exhale left him. He could feel the shift before he saw it. The moment where speculation became proof. Where patterns turned into people. Where theory evolved into betrayal. Outside the room, the stage crew was calling countdowns again. The host was being remiked. The lights were warming up. And still, nobody else knew what JD knew now. He looked toward the makeup mirror, caught his own reflection, and saw something there he hadn't seen since the uniform. The quiet in his own eyes before a breach operation. Focused, controlled, irreversible. He stood, tucked the phone into his inner jacket pocket, and stepped toward the door. His aide caught his eye. "You good?" she asked, voice low. He nodded once. "I'm better than good." From the far side of the stage, a stage manager raised their clipboard. "On in 30. Warren adjusted her posture again, smiled at the mirror, rehearsed the look of reason. But JD wasn't coming back to the stage with talking points. He was coming back with a match. Because this wasn't a debate anymore. It was a countdown. And by the time it hit 0, no one in that studio would be able to claim they didn't know. The countdown hit 5. JD stepped into the light, calm and still, the phone tucked securely into his inside pocket. He could feel the heat of the stage, the shifting air from the overhead rigs, the murmur of the studio audience returning from break. Elizabeth Warren was already in place, poised, smiling again. Her hands folded, her expression ironed smooth. She hadn't seen the video. Not yet. The host gave a tight smile. His earpiece crackled with final instructions. "All right," he murmured under his breath, glancing between the 2 senators. "Let's try to keep this focused. We've had enough fire already tonight." JD didn't answer. The stage manager held up 3 fingers. 2, 1. Red light. Cue. "Welcome back," the host said, chipper. "We're entering our final segment tonight. And if you've just joined us, things have gotten lively. A few chuckles from the audience. Warren smiled politely. JD didn't move. The host turned to him. Senator Vance, you made some serious claims before the break about a nonprofit and a private call. Do you have anything to substantiate those allegations? JD leaned forward slowly. I do, he said. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the phone. The host's eyes flicked to it, confusion etched across his face. JD turned slightly, addressing not just the table, but the room, the country. I have a recording, a Zoom call from March 12th, between senior staff tied to Senator Warren's legislation and private tech donors. In that call, language was discussed, investments were promised, and the American people were nowhere in the conversation. The audience shifted. A low murmuring buzzed in the back rows. The host cleared his throat. Senator, we can't just air unverified material. JD didn't flinch. He looked directly into the camera. America deserves to hear this. Silence. One of the producers behind the glass blinked twice. Another grabbed their headset. What the hell is he doing? This wasn't cleared, someone whispered behind the control console. JD passed the phone to a nearby crew member. It's cued. Play it. The host's eyes darted toward the producer's booth. We really should, but it was too late. The screen above the studio desk flickered once, then again, then faded into a Zoom window. Blurry video, poor audio, 6 boxes, no titles, no context. But one voice rang clear. Keep the language vague. If it's too specific, we can't pivot if the investment stream changes. Another voice replied, we'll tie it to digital sovereignty and spin it green. The silence in the studio was immediate and crushing. Gasps, audible. One woman in the second row put a hand over her mouth. Warren didn't move. Her smile was gone. Her shoulders rose by a fraction. The host stared, frozen in place. Then came the third voice. Familiar, calm, clipped. So long as they keep the checks clear, we'll keep the flag in front. A slow exhale from the crowd. It wasn't speculation anymore. It was voice, tone, timing, evidence. JD turned to the host, who looked like someone trying to calculate damage in real time. Senator Vance, this wasn't authorized. JD's voice remained calm. Neither was the deal. In the control room, phones began ringing. Legal began moving. The segment director mouthed toward the booth, cut or stay live. But the audience wasn't moving. They weren't blinking. They were leaning in, gripping the edges of their chairs like jurors. JD said nothing more, because the clip was still playing, and every word it spilled was a nail, slow, deliberate, echoing into something that had once looked untouchable. And in that moment under those lights, truth was no longer being told. It was being played. The screen faded to black the moment the audio cut. But in the studio, the aftershock still echoed. No one clapped. No one spoke. The recording had finished playing, and for the first time that night, Elizabeth Warren didn't have a follow-up. Her polished calm had frayed, and though the camera wasn't yet back on her, the audience could see it. The tightening jaw, the twitch in her right hand, the way her foot shifted under the desk as if searching for stable ground. This is fake, she said suddenly, sharp, slicing through the tension. Her voice carried over the dead air, louder than intended. This is clearly edited. This is AI or spliced. None of this is real. The host turned toward her slowly, unsure whether to intervene or hide under the desk. JD remained seated, back straight, expression unreadable. He didn't shout. He didn't rise. He just let the silence stretch long enough to expose the cracks in her voice. Then finally he said evenly, truth doesn't need CGI, just a microphone. The line didn't shout, it landed. The audience stirred. The host blinked. Behind the studio glass, a producer pulled off his headset with a loud clatter. Cut, now. The network threw to an emergency commercial break. The screen filled with a pharmaceutical ad, cheery music layered over footage of 2 retirees walking along a beach. The contrast was whiplash. Back inside the studio, chaos bloomed. Stage managers ran toward the desk. Warren's aide pushed past a lighting crew to reach her, whispering rapidly in her ear. Her expression had shifted from disbelief to fury to something that looked like fear. "I want that pulled," she said. "I want it pulled from the air, the stream, the archives, everywhere." The aide nodded, pulling out their phone. "I'll call legal, now." On the other side of the desk, JD remained still, hands clasped in front of him. One of the producers approached hesitantly. "Senator, we weren't informed you'd be airing classified media. You bypassed protocol." JD looked up at him with the calm of someone who had already considered every consequence. "It wasn't classified," he said, "just inconvenient." Another producer shouted from across the studio, "Legal's asking if we vetted the file source. Who's Sentinel?" A tech assistant replied, "It was clean. Encrypted but clean. No malware, no trace." Then paused. "And the voice matches. Spectral profile confirms it." The producer rubbed his face. "God help us." Warren stood up from her chair, but she didn't leave. Not yet. Her chest rose and fell more quickly than before, and her hands were no longer folded. They were clenched. She looked at JD, and for a split second, there was no smile, no policy armor, no campaign rhetoric, just pure human fury. "This was a stunt," she hissed across the desk. "You set this up. You ambushed me." JD met her eyes. "No," he said softly. "I just pressed play." From the wings, the host called out, "We're back in 20. A new panic spread through the room. Do they continue? Do they walk out? What happens if they go live and say nothing? But JD already knew. The public didn't need more speeches. They just heard what mattered. As the seconds ticked down, a producer whispered into the host's earpiece, "Keep it neutral. Redirect if you have to. And God, don't let them say corruption again." The host gave a faint nod, his face pale under the makeup. But the damage had been done. In a city built on illusion, tonight's show had let in something dangerous. Not a shout, not a scandal, but a recording. And the hardest thing about truth wasn't broadcasting it. It was surviving it. The next morning, the episode vanished. No rebroadcast, no archived clip, no podcast audio. Just a quiet, blank placeholder on the network site with a 5-word message. "This content is temporarily unavailable." It hadn't taken long. By 11:07 p.m. the night before, less than an hour after the show ended, legal teams were already on damage control. By midnight, the first corporate sponsor pulled its ad buy for the week. By 12:30, 3 more followed. And by 2 a.m., a private Zoom call between the network's executive board and its largest stakeholders ended with a single, furious order. Scrub it. In the basement-level control suite of the network headquarters, the air smelled of burnt coffee and nerves. "He cost us 7 sponsors, a VP shouted, his tie loosened, pacing back and forth. "You gave him the floor. You let him hijack the broadcast." A producer pushed back. "We didn't know he had the file. Nobody cleared it." "Then why the hell was it playing on national television in full HD? Silence. In another room, the marketing team was already drafting a statement. "We remain committed to balanced dialogue. Regret any confusion. Investigating the incident." The words poured out like water over fire, meant to look clean, but meant to smother. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance's photo was quietly removed from the State Line Sunday website. His chair at the post-show discussion panel was left empty, visibly, awkwardly empty, as if its very presence dared someone to ask why. He hadn't been officially disinvited. He'd just stopped being welcome. In the staff lounge, a junior editor whispered to a colleague, "They pulled the clip so fast it's like it never happened." The colleague replied, "It happened. The internet saw it." Then a beat later, "And they're not going to forget." By morning, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Warren Leak. Hashtag Voice Not Edited. Hashtag Play the Tape. JD's name had been mentioned 140,000 times on X, formerly Twitter, in under 5 hours. Someone had clipped the moment, his calm delivery, the screen flicker, the stunned silence, and set it to a slow, orchestral version of the Star-Spangled Banner. It was already sitting at 3.1 million views. The network's damage control couldn't keep up with the country's curiosity. Back in his Senate office, J.D. Vance sat alone at his desk, watching the morning news flip between outrage and avoidance. Most shows dodged the topic. Some tried to reframe it. A few simply recycled last week's headlines, pretending nothing unusual had happened at all. But J.D. wasn't surprised. He knew the game didn't reward the loudest. It punished the most accurate. His aide knocked once and stepped inside, holding her phone. CNN pulled the whole segment, scrubbed it from YouTube and streaming too. J.D. nodded. Good. Means it landed. She hesitated. They also canceled your invitation to the panel in Atlanta. He looked up. They did me a favor. She didn't smile. Senator, they're going to make this ugly. He didn't flinch. Then they'll finally have to look at it. Outside, the Capitol's flag was limp in the windless morning. Inside, the tremor had already begun. Not in J.D.'s voice, not in Warren's silence, but in the one thing power feared most, a replay button they didn't control. By dawn, the fire was already out of the studio's hands. What the network tried to erase, the public turned into fuel. The clip resurfaced, first on a small Reddit thread, buried under politics and tagged as re-upload before it disappears again. Then it hit Twitter. The algorithm didn't stand a chance. Hashtag Warren leaks. Hashtag state line scandal. Hashtag truth cut through. Within an hour, they were trending in 23 states. By noon, in all 50. The video, now stripped of logos and rebranded with text overlays like, "She said it, we heard it." And the mic wasn't cut, it was passed, had been uploaded to every major platform and a dozen minor ones. Facebook groups for veterans, factory workers, and community educators began sharing it with commentary that felt more like a chorus than scattered outrage. J.D.'s communications director stopped counting at 7,000 messages. Many weren't policy questions. They were confessions. My husband worked at a steel plant Warren's bill helped shut down. You said what we've screamed for years. We're teachers. We teach civics. My students watched you speak with more honesty in 6 minutes than we've seen in 6 years. I'm a retired Marine. Been told to sit down and let the experts talk since I came home. Not anymore. One message was only 5 words. You broke the silence. Finally. J.D. didn't reply to all of them. He couldn't, but he read every line. The surge wasn't clean or polite. It was raw, working class, unfiltered. People weren't asking for nuance. They were asking for someone to stop acting like nuance was a shield for dishonesty. In one small Ohio town, a group of laid-off manufacturing workers watched the clip on a phone propped up on a lunchbox in the back of a mechanic's garage. In Georgia, a grandmother sent the video to her book club group chat with the message, "Y'all need to hear this before they bury it." In rural Pennsylvania, a civics teacher paused his lesson plan and played the audio aloud, letting his class listen not to J.D.'s tone, but to Warren's words. It didn't matter what network aired it first. It mattered that it couldn't be unheard. Back in D.C., J.D. stood in his office overlooking the Capitol. His phone buzzed every 3 seconds. He'd silenced the ringer, but the vibration felt like a pulse running through the room. His aide walked in, phone in hand. "You're at 9 million views, across platforms, not counting private group re-uploads." J.D. nodded, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "They're saying it's fake," she added. "Warren's camp. They're blaming AI, deep fakes." J.D. turned toward her. "Then they're panicking." She hesitated. "One more thing." He waited. "Students from Notre Dame, seniors from Texas VFWs, moms from South Carolina. People are stitching their own videos onto the clip. Stories, reactions, commentary. It's not just content anymore. It's becoming a movement." He didn't smile. He just said quietly, "That's because they were waiting to be heard. I just handed them the mic." Outside, the American flag was still limp in the humid air. But inside the digital world, on screens in classrooms, on kitchen counters and factory floors, the wind had changed. The truth hadn't just gone viral, it had gone personal. By the second day, the headlines had changed their tone. What started as leaked call sends shockwaves through D.C. quietly morphed into something more cautious, more calculated. Zoom leak raises ethical questions, but who's behind it? Is this the rise of political deepfakes? J.D. Vance, whistleblower or opportunist? And then came the real pivot. J.D. Vance fabricates donor video? The question mark was doing all the heavy lifting. The word fabricate had already landed in people's minds. The damage control machine was finally in motion. By mid-afternoon, Senator Warren's communications director gave a polished press statement outside her office steps. The video in question is unverifiable. It has all the hallmarks of foreign disinformation tactics: strategically timed release, emotionally manipulative content, and ambiguous sourcing. We are investigating its origins alongside cybersecurity experts. We urge the public not to fall for coordinated deception. Reporters snapped photos. Microphones buzzed. One question cut through the din. Are you saying the voice in the video isn't yours, Senator? Warren didn't blink. I'm saying we have no record of such a call, and until this is verified through legitimate, nonpartisan channels, I won't dignify a manufactured hoax. Across the city, J.D. watched the press conference from his office, leaning against the windowsill as the video played in silence. His aide stood nearby, holding a fresh folder. They're going full disinfo route, she said, linking you to Russian influence accounts. One pass actually said the video has cyber fingerprints that resemble tactics used in Crimea. J.D. turned toward her. I've never even been to Crimea. She tried to smile, couldn't. And CNN's senior editorial board just released a formal statement distancing the network from the clip. Called it an unexpected editorial deviation from policy. You've officially been labeled a rogue actor. He pushed off the windowsill and walked to his desk. Picked up a printed headline. Did J.D. Vance hand America a lie? Below it, a photo of him mid-sentence. Hand raised, expression caught in a moment that made him look more preacher than senator. They're not coming for the footage, J.D. said. They're coming for the frame. His aide looked confused. Meaning? They can't erase what people heard, so they'll try to erase what they felt when they heard it. Twist the context, seed enough doubt, and suddenly the truth feels optional. She nodded slowly, eyes scanning her phone. It's working. Moderates are hesitating. Some independents are saying they'll wait for confirmation before reacting. J.D. picked up the printed headline, folded it once, and tossed it in the trash. I'm not worried, he said calmly. She tilted her head. How? They're accusing you of pushing propaganda. That's not just spin, that's war. J.D. looked up, voice firm but low. They're used to buying silence, he said. I come free. She stared at him for a moment, then nodded. Once, slowly. The kind of nod that said, okay, then we keep going. Outside, the D.C. air was shifting again. The network spun. The party scrambled. And the machine tried, with all its algorithms and influence, to push the story back into the shadows. But the public had already tasted something different, and J.D. wasn't chasing approval anymore. He was chasing clarity, one step at a time, through noise, doubt, and distraction, toward the part of the fight that couldn't be faked. They cleared the conference table just after sunrise. Every coffee mug, every empty folder, every stack of outdated policy drafts, gone. In their place, one long roll of butcher paper stretched across the wood, already marked with red ink, blue circles, and dozens of yellow post-it notes that looked more like warnings than annotations. J.D. stood at the far end of the table, hands in his pockets, eyes tracing the lines as his chief of staff began. Okay, she said, tapping the top left corner of the paper, where the name Haiyun Institute for Strategic Tech was written in black Sharpie. This is where it starts. On paper, they're an educational think tank based in Guangzhou, but we tracked their funding into a Delaware-registered nonprofit 6 months ago, American Tomorrow Foundation. She moved her hand 2 feet to the right. This group then funnels quarterly research grants to 3 lobbying PACs, all with vague titles: Digital Liberty Now, Climate Forward, and Secure Innovation Coalition. Each name was circled in red. Beneath each, J.D. had scrawled a word in his own handwriting: influence disguised as investment. His comms director jumped in. All 3 PACs then submitted policy briefs to the Senate Subcommittee on Technology and Commerce within a 10-day window. 2 weeks later, Warren's office drafts a companion bill that, miraculously, mirrors about 87% of the language from those briefs. J.D. didn't speak. He just nodded once, his expression sharpening. The chief of staff continued. And here's the kicker. While the bill was moving through committee, those same three PACs made bundled donations totaling just over $2.3 million to supporting legislators. Warren's share? She flipped a folder toward him. Roughly $510,000, all routed through legal donation caps, but arriving through individual, small donor networks, which we now know were seeded by foreign interest groups. JD opened the folder, scanned the figures, and placed it back down. His jaw flexed once. But we didn't stop at campaign money, she added. We cross-referenced the timeline of the legislation with commercial real estate filings in 17 small towns across the Rust Belt and Midwest. She motioned to a separate map now pinned to the corkboard. Each town was marked with a red flag. Properties were purchased by holding companies connected to Horizon Holdings and its U.S. affiliates. Right after Warren's bill introduced tax credits for green-adjacent infrastructure investment. JD stepped closer, scanning the town names. West Liberty, Ohio. Crawfordville, Indiana. Willow Creek, Michigan. Places he'd visited. Places that weren't just names. They were stories. Schools half full. Plants half shuttered. Entire main streets functioning on fumes. He turned back to the team. Are we absolutely certain? His policy aide answered before anyone else could. Yes, Senator. Every link is documented. Financially, legally, logically. Another aide added, and emotionally. JD raised an eyebrow. She clarified. Because every town on that map lost more jobs than they gained from these projects. The solar builds were shells. Nothing broke ground in over half the locations. He stared at the corkboard again, and for the first time in days didn't say a word. Because this wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a pattern. A quiet, systemic betrayal that masked itself in progressive branding and clean energy buzzwords. A machine that used idealism as a front and economic despair as cover. He reached for a pen and circled one word at the center of the paper. Translation. Everyone in the room paused. Translation? His chief of staff asked. JD nodded. We need to turn all of this, from paper to pain, from finance to faces. If we want people to understand what was taken from them, we have to show them who took it and how. He looked back at the map. And I know where we'll start. The sign read, Welcome to West Liberty, where industry meets integrity. But the letters were faded now, the white paint chipped and curling at the edges. One bolt on the top right corner had come loose, so the whole sign leaned slightly to the left, like it had given up trying to stand straight. JD Vance stepped out of the rental car and took a long breath of cold Ohio air. It smelled faintly of rust and winter, a scent he hadn't forgotten. Not from his own hometown, not from all the places like this one, tucked between counties and memories. West Liberty wasn't ghosted completely, but it was close. Of the 3 manufacturing facilities that once anchored the town, 2 were shut down. The third, a solar components warehouse that had promised 500 green jobs in 3 years, stood boarded up behind chain-link fencing, its logo half scraped off, its parking lot cracked with weeds. He walked alone past shuttered diners, plywood-covered windows, and a closed-down barber shop whose sign still read, Walk-ins welcome. But there hadn't been a walk-in here in years. He turned onto a side street, following the address a contact had sent him. The house was a small, single-story ranch, light blue with a sagging roof and a front porch whose steps were buckled by frost. A man in his late 50s stepped out to greet him. Jeans, Carhartt jacket, hands rough enough to sand metal, eyes tired enough to have seen too much. Senator, the man said, shaking JD's hand, name's Paul Denton. I worked 27 years at Liberty Steel before they sold it off. JD nodded. Thanks for seeing me, Paul. They sat on 2 plastic chairs in the front yard. Paul didn't offer coffee. He offered something heavier. This was a working town, Paul said, looking out over the cracked pavement. Not rich, not fancy, but we earned what we had. Then came the bill. Bunch of folks in suits flew in, said we'd be the Midwest model for clean energy. Called it a flagship site. JD listened. They bought the old plant, said they'd retrofit it, new jobs, training programs. Media even came out here when they held that ribbon cutting. Paul added, shaking his head. They left 6 months later, said market conditions shifted. He reached into a folder on the table beside him and pulled out a single yellowed sheet of paper. JD took it gently. A foreclosure notice. The stamped date was just 3 weeks old. They said clean energy, Paul said, voice low and level. What they meant was clean us out. JD didn't respond right away. He read the letter twice. The words blurred into policy codes, penalty clauses, and bureaucratic distancing. But Paul's voice cut through it. My wife's been cleaning houses 2 towns over. My son left for Texas. I've got a granddaughter I see on a screen, not in person. And I've got friends who, when they saw that plant go dark again, didn't get back up. He paused, then added, I don't care what they call it. Climate bill, innovation bill. If it costs a town its dignity, it ain't a solution. JD folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the folder, and looked out at the street, where a single American flag fluttered from a rusted pole in someone's yard. I'm going to read this on the Senate floor, he said. Not the policy. Your words, Paul gave a tired nod. You do that. Maybe this time someone will actually hear him. JD stood, shook his hand again, and walked back to the car in silence. The wind picked up behind him, dragging leaves across the cracked asphalt like scattered memories, trying to find a place to settle. 2 days later, J.D. Vance walked onto the Senate floor, holding nothing but a manila folder and a printed title page. He didn't bring a teleprompter. He didn't need applause. He brought a voice and a story that didn't sound like legislation. It sounded like a town. The chamber was half full at first. Midweek sessions often were. A few senators glanced up when he took the podium, expecting routine remarks. Most continued reviewing notes, texting aides, sipping coffee behind neutral expressions. Then JD placed the title page down. The words were large and unmissable. The price of vague bills. The room quieted a notch. JD began. Madam President, I rise today not to attack a colleague, nor to debate the future of energy, or innovation, or the digital marketplace. I rise to explain what happens when policy is written with language soft enough to hide a knife. 1 or 2 heads turn. I recently visited a town called West Liberty. On paper, it's a case study in transition, recipient of federal clean energy incentives, home to a high-potential solar investment program. That's what the bill said. That's what the press release celebrated. He held up the foreclosure letter Paul had given him. In reality, it's a town with boarded windows, empty schools, and workers who now deliver groceries in towns they used to employ. This, he waved the letter gently, is what happens when legislation is written by people who never have to live with what they sign. Now the chamber was listening. JD didn't raise his voice. He lowered it, just slightly. There are names we can debate. Pax Terra Foundation, Horizon Holdings, Climate Forward PAC. Names that sound noble. But the funding, if you follow it, begins in places whose interests do not align with ours. It moves through nonprofits in Delaware and lands in language so broad, so politically safe, that no one ever stops to ask, why is this so quiet? Why does no one name the beneficiaries? He looked around the room. If a policy is good, why are they paying to keep it quiet? Silence. Pure, weighty silence. One older senator near the back removed his glasses slowly. Another straightened in his chair. JD continued. I'm not against innovation. I'm not against clean energy. I'm against bills that hide foreign investment behind environmental virtue. I'm against language that says equity and delivers nothing but equity stakes to people we never elected in places we'll never visit, with motives we'll never see. He paused, then unfolded a simple printout. 17 town names, each marked with a red dot. These are the towns bought and sold under that language. These are the zip codes that got promised jobs and got silence instead. And these are the voters who were told they had champions in this chamber, while their land was quietly pre-purchased by foreign-financed shell companies. He lowered the page. And the worst part? They didn't even get the dignity of being called a sacrifice. They were just omitted. Nobody spoke. Even the C-SPAN camera didn't cut away. JD stepped back from the podium. I submit these letters, these transactions, and these maps not as a protest, but as a mirror, so that we may see clearly what vague language buys and what it costs. He walked away without waiting for a response. Behind him, a senator who'd served 3 decades in the chamber slowly leaned forward, hands clasped, and whispered to his aide, "This one won't get buried." And somewhere far from the Capitol, in a quiet Ohio town that still bore a rusted sign, someone turned off their screen and whispered the same thing. The first PAC issued its statement at 7:42 a.m. It was short, 4 sentences, no adjectives, no emotion. In light of recent developments in pending full internal review, Forward Path PS is suspending all financial contributions to Senator Elizabeth Warren's re-election campaign. We remain committed to transparency, ethical policy advocacy, and responsible engagement in the democratic process. Further updates will follow upon review. By 9/10, 2 more followed. Equity First Action Fund and Americans for Sustainable Growth released near identical messages. Same phrasing, same tone, and most notably, the same sudden silence where their unwavering support used to be. On Capitol Hill, the tremor was immediate. Staffers passed phones with wide eyes. Inbox flags turned red faster than they could be opened. Communications directors huddled behind closed doors trying to stay ahead of a story that was no longer in their hands. Inside Senator Warren's office, the lights were on, but the mood was dim. No one said the word panic, not yet, but the data said it for them. That night, her internal polling dropped 8 points nationally, 12 in the Midwest. Among independents, the erosion was faster. The word trust no longer polled above 50%. For a candidate who had built her brand on integrity, the fracture cut deep. By the following morning, reporters no longer asked if the funding freeze would expand. They asked who was next. Warren's campaign chair walked into her office holding a printed list. "We've confirmed 7 more donors are pressing pause." Quietly, no statements yet, but they're ghosting us. This isn't just about that file anymore. It's about perception. Warren didn't look up from her desk. She was staring at the memo her own staff had drafted 6 months ago, the one that read, "Language intentionally broad, avoid specifics, build moral framing." The words that once felt clever now felt like an echo, repeating back to her from every article, every comment thread, every camera flash. She set the paper down. "Find me a stage," she said finally, "a microphone, a crowd that still believes." The campaign chair hesitated. "We're trying, but—" Warren looked up sharply. "But what?" He exhaled. "The crowds are watching J.D. Vance right now, and they're not just watching, they're quoting." Outside across the street, a protester held a hand-painted sign. "If a policy's good, why are they paying to keep it quiet?" In J.D. Vance's office, the mood was no less serious, but far more focused. He stood with his chief of staff reviewing a list of districts where the flag PX had previously spent ad dollars. "They're retreating from her," she said, "but they're not retreating from the system, just realigning, waiting for this to cool down." J.D. nodded slowly. "Then we don't let it cool." She flipped a page. "You've got 5 town halls scheduled this month. 3 are already over capacity. People are showing up with their own receipts, land records, donor lists, even union memos." J.D. took the list and tapped one name near the bottom. "Eastview, that's where we go next." She looked at him. "Why that one?" He folded the paper in half and tucked it into his pocket. "Because that's where they started pretending this was about progress, and I want to show what it looks like when people stop pretending." Outside, the headlines kept spinning. The PAC stayed quiet, and Elizabeth Warren, once untouchable, was now surrounded not by donors, but by distance. And the silence wasn't strategic anymore. It was vacancy. 2 days after the funding freeze began, J.D. returned to his office and found the usual stack of mail waiting on the corner of his desk. Most were the standard fare: briefings, reports, press inquiries. But beneath them all was a single envelope with no return address, just his name written in slanted, uneven cursive. The kind of handwriting that came from someone who still took their time. He opened it slowly. Inside was one sheet, lined paper, ink slightly smudged. The letter was handwritten, word by word. No signature, no name. But every syllable carried weight. "I voted for her. Twice. I believed in her voice. But I watched you that night, And for the first time in years, I didn't feel sold to. I felt seen. You didn't embarrass her. You reminded us what integrity looked like. Thank you for not yelling. Thank you for asking the question none of us thought was allowed. Keep going. JD didn't move for a while. He read the letter again, then a third time. He folded it carefully and slid it into the top right drawer of his desk. Beneath an old campaign flyer and a paperclip chain one of his kids had made during a late-night session years ago. It wasn't just the content of the letter that stayed with him. It was the tone. It wasn't angry. It wasn't gleeful. It was grateful, quietly, as if the writer had finally exhaled after holding something in for far too long. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, thinking not about the next move, but about how many people out there felt the same way. People who hadn't written, people who didn't know how. That letter wasn't alone. Over the next few days, the office received dozens more. Emails, handwritten notes, folded flyers with messages scrawled in margins. Some from conservatives, some from liberals, some from people who said they'd never voted at all. A retired librarian from New Hampshire wrote, "It felt like someone finally read the fine print aloud. We stopped reading it years ago. Figured the ink was already dry." A factory foreman from Indiana included a photo of his old union badge and simply wrote, "You gave us one sentence." It said more than the last decade of hearings. A student from Berkeley ended her typed note with, "I don't agree with everything you stand for, but I agree with how you stood, and that counts for more than I ever expected." JD didn't reply to them, not all of them, but he read every single word. His staff noticed he started keeping a small stack in his briefcase. No one asked why. The impact wasn't public. It didn't make the evening news or the trending page, but it changed something in the office, in him. It reminded everyone there that the work wasn't just about exposure or headlines. It was about reminders, that courage could be quiet, that accountability didn't have to come with applause, that sometimes the deepest wounds weren't healed with victory, they were soothed with recognition. As JD looked out his office window, watching traffic move through the streets below, he said softly to no one in particular, "They're listening again." The summons came with little fanfare, an email marked urgent from the Senate Committee on Ethics. JD wasn't surprised. After all the noise, this was the room where silence liked to settle scores. But what caught his attention was the subject line: witness appearance, oversight session, public trust and legislative transparency. Not defendant, not respondent, witness. When JD entered the hearing room, it was half filled. No cameras, no press pit, just wood-paneled formality and staffers scribbling notes like stenographers of the invisible. Across the table sat the panel, a mix of Republicans and Democrats, older faces worn down by decades of ethics reviews that rarely meant much. But today there was something different in the air, an unease behind their composed expressions. JD sat steady, his hands folded on the table. The chair opened dryly. "We are here to review concerns raised regarding bill sponsorship practices and potential foreign influence lobbying pathways. Mr. Vance, thank you for your cooperation." JD gave a slight nod. "Glad to help clarify anything the public deserves to understand." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bring props. He spoke clearly, outlining the donor map, the nonprofit shell games, the vague bill language passed under the banner of justice but backed by foreign interest groups. He answered every question, even the skeptical ones, with receipts and restraint. It wasn't a trial. It wasn't theater. It was something rarer, a moment of uncomfortable truth in a room built to avoid it. When it was over, the committee called a recess. As JD stood to leave, a veteran senator from across the aisle approached. He didn't smile. He didn't linger, just leaned in and whispered, "You didn't just call out a bill. You called out the system?" JD didn't respond, but the weight of those words settled more heavily than any accusation could. Outside, the wind pushed against the Capitol flags. Inside, the quiet held its breath. The podcast room wasn't grand. No marble backdrop, no Senate seal, just a round mic, 2 chairs, and a quiet space where questions couldn't hide behind applause. Across from JD sat a young journalist, clear-eyed, barely 30, more interested in truth than clicks. She tapped her notepad once, then leaned forward. "Would you do it again?" The question hung there, not sharp, not soft, just honest. JD took a long breath, gaze drifting momentarily to the old coffee stain on the wall. The silence wasn't discomfort, it was weight. He ran his hand over the armrest, then looked back at her with the kind of tired peace only earned through storms. "Next time," he said, voice even, "I'd bring a second copy. Just in case they try to lose the first." The journalist blinked, surprised. Then she smiled, not out of amusement, but recognition. They both knew what he meant. Truth, once spoken, becomes fragile. People misplace it. Systems bury it. Networks spin it. But a second copy? That was a promise. To the story, and to those who never got one the first time. JD leaned closer. "I didn't go in to burn someone down. I went in because I thought silence was costing us too much. Turns out, I underestimated just how high that cost was." The interview wrapped shortly after. There was no viral twist, no outburst. Just a final note that didn't beg for attention. It asked for memory. As JD stepped out into the hallway, the building didn't feel like Washington anymore. It felt like a courthouse for truth, a place where verdicts weren't handed down, but earned by what people chose to remember. And memory, unlike microphones, doesn't need permission to turn back on. The office hadn't changed much since JD first stepped into it. Same old bookshelf, same pot of stubborn, half-living ivy. But something was new now. One frame on the far wall. Not gold-trimmed, not oversized, just simple wood, honest in its edges. Inside the frame, a donor chart. The one from that night. The chart that cracked open the silence. A thick red line slashed across the largest contributor's name. Below it, engraved into a small plaque. "They tried to buy her voice, so I used mine." It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't revenge. It was reminder, not just to JD, but to everyone who stepped into that room. Interns, veterans, custodians, even opponents. The truth didn't need elevation. It needed visibility. Visitors often paused there. Some nodded, others said nothing. One lobbyist, after a tense meeting on rural funding, stood before it for several minutes. He didn't speak, just looked. Then left his talking points on the chair and walked out, unread. Even staffers, those who'd grown used to the churn, would sometimes find themselves glancing at it during long nights, as if it anchored them when the headlines got too loud or the inbox is too heavy. But for JD, the frame meant something else. It was the soundproof box for a moment the world tried to silence. The red line wasn't just ink, it was refusal. Refusal to pretend. Refusal to obey the script. And every time he passed it, JD would think of the steelworker, the veteran's wife, the teenage girl who'd written him just 4 words. You made it count. He hadn't burned down the Capitol. He hadn't become a martyr. He just left something behind that couldn't be unframed. In a small-town high school tucked between empty factories and still streets, a civics teacher queued up a clip. The projector buzzed faintly. Fluorescent lights flickered. A dozen students shifted in their seats, half expecting another dry lecture on procedural ethics. Instead, JD Vance's voice filled the room. If a policy's good, why are they paying to keep it quiet? The classroom stilled. On screen, the Senate chamber sat frozen in that rare kind of silence. One earned, not imposed. JD's figure stood steady, his tone calm, his words sharp without being cruel. No theatrics, just a line drawn clearly in public. The teacher clicked pause. "So?" she said, gesturing gently toward the image. "What just happened?" A few shrugged. One boy leaned back, arms crossed. But in the back row, a girl slowly raised her hand. "Did he win?" The question broke the surface like a pebble tossed into still water. The teacher considered. Not carefully, truthfully. "No," she said finally. "He didn't win a medal. He didn't get promoted. Some called him reckless. Others tried to erase it altogether." She paused, glancing back at the paused frame. "But he made the powerful stop, smiling. That's better than a trophy." The girl nodded slowly. Another student whispered, "Dang." The teacher continued, her voice softer now. "See, what stayed behind wasn't just what he said, it's that someone dared to say it. In a room full of filtered words, he spoke without a leash." The bell rang. Backpacks zipped. Chairs scraped. But as the students filed out, one stayed behind. She stared at the screen for a second longer, then turned to the teacher. "Do you think I could ever do that? Speak like that?" The teacher smiled, not the smile of reassurance, but of belief. "You just did. One question can change a room." Outside, the wind swept through the school flag, quiet but firm. This story reminds us that real courage isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about standing still when the ground shakes beneath you. JD didn't seek applause. He sought accountability. And in doing so, he left something behind that no microphone could amplify: integrity. It's not about winning the argument. It's about changing what people remember. Now it's your turn. If the truth cost you everything, would you still speak it out loud? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.